In what is being called the most consequential diplomatic collapse of the 21st century, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked out of the Oval Office not at the end of a meeting, not after a breakdown in negotiations, but 14 minutes in. 14 minutes into what was supposed to be the most significant day of both leaders' careers. There was no handshake, no joint statement, no rose garden ceremony. He closed his briefing folder. He stood up from his chair. He adjusted his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who had already decided everything that needed deciding. He looked directly at the President of the United States. He said something, and then he walked out of the most powerful office on earth. He moved through the West Wing without breaking stride, past a stunned Secret Service detail, through the white columns and down the steps, into a waiting motorcade that pulled away from the North Portico before a single American official could reach him. Behind him on the Resolute desk died the most ambitious trade agreement attempted between the two nations since 1988. 11 months of negotiation, more than 200 officials from both governments, a comprehensive economic framework worth nearly $500 billion, gone. Not because of incompatible interests, not because the economics could not be reconciled, because of what was said in that room, in that moment, in a tone that made continuing impossible for any leader of a sovereign nation with functioning self-respect. The signing pens were already on the desk. The press pool was already assembled in the Rose Garden. The joint statement had been drafted, reviewed, and approved by both governments. Everything was in place. And then the meeting started. When you hear what was said in that room, 7 words spoken quietly, heard by 4 people, and leaked to the world within 90 minutes, you will understand why this is not a failed negotiation. This is a verdict. The agreement had a name, the Comprehensive North American Economic Framework. And on the morning of the walkout, it was not a proposal. It was not a draft. It was a done deal, reviewed, approved, and ready for 2 signatures that were scheduled to happen at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Not because one side had surrendered, not because one economy had been forced to its knees. Both delegations had spent 11 months building something neither could build alone. The energy provisions protected American consumers. The mineral supply chains protected American defense. The dispute resolution mechanism protected both economies from the kind of overnight policy chaos that had paralyzed investment and hiring across 2 countries for 2 years straight. This was not charity. This was architecture. Bilateral, load-bearing, irreplaceable architecture, and it was finished. The press credentials had been issued. The photographers were already positioning themselves on the Rose Garden lawn. Senior advisors on both sides had exchanged congratulations the night before. One American official described the mood at 7 that morning as the closest thing to relief he had felt in 2 years of negotiations that had nearly collapsed 4 separate times. Then the meeting started, and within the first 60 seconds, something shifted. Not in the numbers, not in the terms, not in anything written in the 400-page framework sitting on that desk. It shifted in tone, in framing, in the specific, deliberate choice of words used by one man in that room to describe what the other man's country had just agreed to. Not a partnership, not a bilateral achievement, a concession, extracted by pressure, owed by obligation. 5 seconds of contempt. That is the unit of measure for what destroyed $500 billion, not trade policy, not economic incompatibility, not a failure of diplomacy, pride. One man's inability, in the final moment of an 11-month process, to resist telling the other side that they should be grateful. That is what killed the deal. To understand what died in that room, you need to understand what was on that table. Because the scale of what was destroyed in 14 minutes is not just dramatic. It is catastrophic in ways that most coverage has failed to fully price. The Comprehensive North American Economic Framework covered 6 domains. Each one was not a line item in a trade agreement. Each one was a structural solution to a problem that had been bleeding both economies for 2 years. First, energy. A 20-year bilateral security pact guaranteeing American access to Canadian oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power at preferential pricing. The Department of Energy had projected that provision alone would save American consumers an estimated $47 billion over the agreement's term. American refineries, specifically those designed for heavy sour crude, the high sulfur blend that Canadian oil sands produce, had been operating below capacity for 24 months because tariff uncertainty had disrupted the cross-border logistics that their entire supply chain was engineered around. Second, critical minerals, a joint supply chain framework securing American access to Canadian nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements. These are not commodities. The Pentagon had formally identified each one as essential to national defense production. American industry could not source them domestically at scale. There was no domestic alternative. The framework would have ended that structural vulnerability permanently. Third, automotive manufacturing. A restructured content framework that would have restarted shuttered assembly plants and created an estimated 60,000 jobs across Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, and Ontario. 60,000 jobs that had been held in suspension for 2 years while the rules of the trading relationship changed based on a single person's social media activity. Fourth, agricultural trade. The elimination of reciprocal tariffs that had devastated American farmers selling into Canadian markets and locked Canadian producers out of American grocery supply chains. Farm states had been bleeding quietly for 2 years. This provision was their exit. Fifth, digital trade and intellectual property. A framework the technology sector had been formally requesting for years, providing legal clarity across a border that processes more digital commerce than any other bilateral relationship on Earth. Sixth, and most consequentially, the binding dispute resolution mechanism, an independent bilateral tribunal with the authority to adjudicate trade disputes before either government could impose unilateral tariffs. This single provision was worth more than all the others combined, not because of what it created, because of what it ended. 2 years of strategic paralysis, 2 years during which companies on both sides of the border could not plan, could not invest, could not hire, could not commit to long-term capital expenditure because the rules could change overnight. Both delegations believed the deal was done. Both governments had told their respective cabinets it was done. Both teams had privately celebrated the night before. The pens were on the desk. The meeting was supposed to last 45 minutes. It lasted 14. The meeting began at 9:47 in the morning. Both leaders were accompanied by small delegations, 4 officials each, selected for seniority and for discretion. The room held 8 people, a 400-page agreement, and a set of signing pens that no one would touch. The president opened with remarks that, according to multiple officials present, began cordially. Routine pleasantries. Acknowledgement of the work both teams had done. The kind of opening that signals a meeting designed to confirm, not to negotiate. Then the tone shifted. Within the first 2 minutes, the president began reframing the agreement, not as a bilateral achievement built by 2 governments over 11 months, as a concession, as something Canada had been compelled to accept because American tariff pressure had left it no choice. He described the energy provisions as, and multiple sources in the room used the same phrasing, Canada finally giving America what it had always been owed. He characterized the critical minerals framework as a formal recognition that Canadian resources exist primarily to serve American industrial needs. And he referred to the dispute resolution mechanism, the single provision that both negotiating teams considered the agreement's most important structural innovation, as a formality included to make Canada feel like it has a voice. Carney did not respond. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him. His expression did not change. He did not react to the characterization of the energy provisions. He did not respond to the framing of Canadian sovereignty as American entitlement. He took no notes. He asked no questions. Officials present later described his stillness not as patience, but as calculation. One described it specifically as the silence of a man who has stopped negotiating and started deciding. By the 7th minute, 2 Canadian officials in the room had registered that something had shifted, not because of anything Carney said, but because of the quality of his silence, which had become something different from his usual analytical reserve. Then came minute 12. The president, apparently interpreting 11 minutes of silence as acquiescence, leaned forward. According to 3 of the 8 people in that room, who independently provided accounts consistent in substance, if not in every word, he said the following: "Mark, I'm going to be honest with you. You needed this deal more than we did. Everyone knows that. Your economy cannot survive without us, and we both know it. So let's not pretend this is a partnership of equals. You got a good deal, better than you deserved, and you should be thanking me instead of sitting there like you're doing me a favor. The room went silent, not the working silence of a negotiation, the absolute silence of a threshold being crossed. Carney did not respond for approximately 10 seconds. Then he placed both hands flat on the table. He closed his briefing folder with a single deliberate motion. He stood up, he adjusted his jacket, and he looked directly at the President of the United States. Not with anger, not with theatrical indignation, but with the flat, clinical expression of a man who had completed a calculation and arrived at a final answer. He said 7 words. Then he turned, walked to the door, opened it himself, and left. Stay. Because those 7 words will be quoted in every negotiation classroom, every foreign ministry, and every boardroom for the next 50 years. And you need to hear exactly what they mean. You just paid full price for nothing. 7 words, spoken quietly, no raised voice, no theatrical pause, delivered with the flat precision of a closing argument from a man who had spent 11 months building something and 14 minutes watching it be dismantled by ego. 7 words that leaked to every major newsroom within 90 minutes of the motorcade leaving the North Portico. On the surface, the meaning is surgical. You had a 400-page agreement worth $480 billion sitting on the Resolute desk. You destroyed it. You received nothing in exchange. You paid the maximum possible price, the total loss of the entire framework, and walked away with 0. Not a concession. Not an improved position, not a single clause more favorable than what was already agreed. 0. But beneath the surface, those 7 words are not about the meeting. They are a forensic audit of 2 years of economic warfare. You spent 2 years imposing tariffs that damaged your own consumers, disrupted your own supply chains, and increased input costs for your own manufacturers. You spent 2 years generating strategic uncertainty so severe that American companies froze capital expenditure, deferred hiring decisions, and postponed long-term investment commitments. Not because of Canadian policy, but because your own trade posture made the future unplannable. You spent 2 years alienating the ally whose critical minerals your defense industrial base cannot replace, whose energy infrastructure your grid operators depend on, whose automotive supply chain is physically integrated with your own at a level that no tariff can restructure without years of industrial dislocation. And at the end of all of it, at the precise moment when 11 months of painstaking negotiation had produced an exit ramp, a resolution, a structure that would have ended the uncertainty and delivered tangible economic benefit to both countries, you destroyed it. Not because the terms were wrong, not because the economics had changed, because you could not resist in the final 60 seconds of an 11-month process, instructing the other side to express gratitude. That is what those 7 words mean at the structural level. They are not an insult, they are an invoice. And the economic damage they describe is not metaphorical. The binding dispute resolution mechanism that died on that desk represented hundreds of billions in reduced business uncertainty. The kind of uncertainty that quantitative trading algorithms price into equity valuations the moment it becomes permanent. The kind that sovereign wealth funds build into governance risk premiums. The kind that allied governments now factor into the reliability calculus of every future negotiation with Washington. 7 words spoken in a room with 8 people, understood immediately by every boardroom, every foreign ministry, and every trading floor on Earth. The deal was not killed by the walkout. The deal was killed by the 5 seconds that made the walkout inevitable. There is a man named David Kowalski. He is a tooling engineer at an assembly plant outside Detroit. He has worked the same line for 19 years. For 2 years, his plant ran at 60% capacity, while trade negotiators argued about parts content ratios and rules of origin thresholds that David could not influence and could barely pronounce. 3 weeks before the walkout, his plant manager told the floor that the deal was coming, that full capacity was coming back, that the 60,000 jobs suspended across Michigan and Ohio and Tennessee were coming back. David had already put down a deposit on a house. There is a woman named Sandra Merritt. She farms 1,200 acres of winter wheat outside Salina, Kansas. Her Canadian market access had been severed by retaliatory tariffs 18 months earlier. Her last 2 harvests sat in storage longer than any harvest in her family's 3 generations of farming. She had been told by her senator, by her agricultural cooperative, by every source she trusted, that the deal would reopen that market before the next planting season. These are the people who paid for what happened in that room. Then Trump appeared publicly. Within 2 hours of the walkout, he called Carney weak, a characterization immediately contradicted by every analyst who noted that walking out of the Oval Office on a sitting president requires the precise opposite of weakness. He said Carney had cost Canada $500 billion, a claim immediately corrected by economists who pointed out that American losses from the deal's collapse equaled or exceeded Canadian ones. He posted 14 times in 3 hours. Each post more aggressive, more personal, more disconnected from the arithmetic of what had actually happened. Carney flew back to Ottawa, convened his cabinet, and issued 3 paragraphs through the Foreign Affairs Ministry. No press conference, no social media, no fury. 3 paragraphs that said more about the composure gap between the 2 governments than any speech could have. Who handled this better, Carney or Trump? Tell us in the comments. The damage did not stop at the West Wing door. 90 minutes after the motorcade left the North Portico, the 7 words had reached every major newsroom on Earth. Not as a rumor, as a confirmed account from multiple officials present in the room. By the time American markets opened the following morning, the story was not a diplomatic incident. It was a pricing event. The S&P 500 fell 2.1%. The Toronto Stock Exchange fell 3.4%. Over $110 billion in combined market capitalization evaporated in a single trading session. Quantitative algorithms had already repriced the entire bilateral risk premium before most retail investors had read the headline. The Canadian dollar strengthened against the United States dollar, a move that initially surprised analysts until its meaning became clear. The market was not pricing in Canadian vulnerability, it was pricing in Canadian credibility. And credibility had just migrated north. 6 hours after the walkout, Canada's retaliatory measures arrived. Targeted tariffs on American agricultural exports, calibrated with surgical precision to hit the farm states that constitute the president's most loyal electoral base. A suspension of energy export commitments that American grid operators had been counting on for winter capacity planning. A freeze on $31 billion in pending American corporate investments in Canadian resource extraction, investments that had been awaiting regulatory approval and were now indefinitely suspended. And the announcement that Canada would begin immediate negotiations with the European Union and Japan on a multilateral trade framework explicitly designed to replace the structural functions of the bilateral agreement that had just died on the Resolute desk. The international response was not sympathy. It was recalculation. Every allied government watching the negotiation drew the same conclusions simultaneously. If an 11-month process producing a framework worth $480 billion could be destroyed in 14 minutes by remarks that no advisor had approved and no strategy had required, then no negotiation with Washington was structurally safe. The risk was not positional. It was behavioral. And behavioral risk cannot be hedged with better lawyers or more precise contract language. France's president said, "We have all learned something today about the fragility of American commitments." Germany's chancellor said, "Reliability is the currency of diplomacy." Today, that currency was devalued. Japan's prime minister said only 5 words, "We are reviewing our assumptions." 5 words interpreted by every analyst in Tokyo as the most significant reassessment of the United States and Japan economic relationship in a generation. 3 allied nations in advanced trade negotiations with Washington quietly requested timeline extensions. 2 major sovereign wealth funds adjusted their American asset allocations downward, not dramatically, but directionally. The European Commission circulated an internal memo recommending that future agreements with the United States include behavioral stability clauses requiring final approval through institutional channels rather than personal presidential meetings. The fact that such a memo was necessary said everything. A sovereign nation's conduct had become a contractual risk factor. That is not a headline. That is a structural shift in how the world prices American commitments. Here is the final accounting. $480 billion, 11 months of negotiation, 200 officials from 2 governments, 4 near collapses, a 14-hour emergency session in Geneva, a 400-page framework reviewed and approved by both governments, signing pens on the Resolute desk, photographers already positioned in the Rose Garden, destroyed in 14 minutes, $110 billion in combined market value erased in a single trading session, 60,000 jobs returned to suspension, $31 billion in frozen investment, farm markets closed, energy commitments suspended, 3 allied governments recalibrating their assumptions about American reliability, the European Commission drafting contract language specifically designed to protect against presidential behavior, not a policy failure, not an economic incompatibility, not a breakdown in negotiation, 5 seconds of contempt in a room with 8 people, and 1 man who stood up, adjusted his jacket, looked directly at the most powerful elected official on earth, and delivered the most precise verdict in modern diplomatic history. 7 words, spoken quietly, heard by 4 people. Understood by every government, every trading floor, and every boardroom on earth within 90 minutes. You just paid full price for nothing. If you want analysis that goes where mainstream coverage stops, subscribe. Because what comes next will matter more than what just happened.